When my boss told me I'd have to stay late, I expected more work. But instead, she gave me remember the night so clearly because it started out just like any other late shift. The office was quiet in that hollow way it gets after hours. The hum of the vending machine, the low buzz of the exit sign, and the faint glow of the city lights spilling in through the tall windows. Everyone else had already gone home. Their desks sat empty, chairs pushed in neatly, the air carrying that faint, almost lonely silence that lingers when the day is done. I was finishing up a report when I heard the sound of heels approaching, steady, unhurried, each step echoing softly down the corridor. When she appeared at the edge of my desk, I straightened almost instinctively. My boss wasn't the type you ever really relaxed around. She carried herself with this quiet authority, always composed, every detail about her polished. Tonight, though, something about her felt different. She leaned lightly against the corner of my desk, setting down a slim folder with deliberate grace. Her perfume reached me before her words did, not overpowering, just a subtle note of warmth, like sandalwood with a hint of something floral. "You'll stay late tonight," she said, her tone calm, but edged with something softer, less formal. Then, after the smallest pause, she added with a half-smile that made my chest tighten, "But you'll like why." I froze for a second, my pen still in my hand, heart tapping a little faster than it should have. Normally, staying late meant spreadsheets, revisions, maybe another lecture on efficiency. But the way she said it, the almost playful glimmer in her eyes, it unsettled me in the best possible way. I tried to keep my voice even. "Is there more work that needs to be done?" Her smile deepened just slightly. "Not the kind you're used to." She didn't elaborate, just gathered the folder closer, as if keeping the answer tucked away until she decided I'd earned it. For a moment, I just watched her, caught between confusion and curiosity. The office lighting cast a soft glow along her features, and I noticed things I usually didn't allow myself to linger on. The way a loose strand of hair brushed against her cheek, the faint lines at the corners of her eyes that spoke more of laughter than age, and the way her voice seemed to soften when it wasn't directed at a room full of employees. I nodded, pretending to be casual, but inside I felt that tug of anticipation, the kind that makes you hyper-aware of every sound, every movement. The office around us seemed different, less like a workplace, more like a stage for something quietly unfolding. As she turned to walk toward her own office, her blazer shifting with each step, she glanced back once, just long enough to catch my eyes again. No words, just that small, knowing look, as if she understood perfectly the storm she'd left brewing in my chest. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't dreading this late night. I was waiting for it. A reason I expected the hours ahead to be filled with documents, long explanations, and the usual rhythm of deadlines. But when I stepped into her office, it didn't feel like work at all. The space looked almost unfamiliar at night. She had turned off the harsh overhead lights, leaving only a desk lamp glowing in the corner, its warm amber spilling across the room. Shadows softened the edges of everything, giving the office a kind of hush, like a place not meant for business anymore. She gestured toward the small round table by the window, not her desk. That was the first surprise. Waiting there were 2 porcelain mugs, steam curling up gently into the dim light. "Tea," she said, as though it were the most natural thing. Not exactly on the company expense report, but I thought it would help us slow down. Her voice had none of the clipped professionalism I was used to. It was lower, steadier, almost kind. I sat across from her, and when I wrapped my hands around the mug, the heat sank into my skin, grounding me. The tea carried a subtle fragrance, maybe jasmine or something close, delicate, calming. She had taken off her blazer and draped it over the back of her chair. Without it, she looked less like my boss and more like just a woman sitting across from me. The way the lamplight softened against her hair, the way her smile lingered a second longer than usual, it all chipped away at the sharp edges of formality I'd always seen her carry. We talked, at first, about nothing in particular. A book she had read on her last vacation. The way the city sounded different at night, quieter, like it finally allowed itself to breathe. I told her about a song I couldn't get out of my head lately, and instead of brushing it off, she leaned in slightly, asking me to hum a few notes so she'd recognize it. I laughed, shaking my head, embarrassed, but she only smiled wider, eyes bright with interest. Somewhere between one story and the next, I realized how different her laughter sounded when it wasn't in a meeting. It wasn't polite or measured. It was genuine, low, and warm, filling the room with something that felt too human for a corporate office. At one point, I looked up from my tea and caught her watching me. Not in the way a manager measures their employee, but in the quiet, studying way of someone curious about another person. For just a second, neither of us said anything, and the silence between us felt natural, almost necessary. The office no longer felt like the place I had worked in every day for months. The computers, the whiteboards, the paperwork, they faded into the background. What remained was this strange intimacy. An ordinary table turned into something more because of who sat across from me. And though I couldn't explain it, I knew this wasn't just another late night at work. Something about the way she leaned in, the way her voice softened, told me she hadn't asked me to stay for tasks or deadlines. No, she had asked me to stay for her, or forget. As the minutes stretched on, I realized how rare it was to see her this way. Not leading, not instructing, but simply talking. Her posture relaxed, her voice less clipped, and her eyes softer, as if some invisible weight had slipped from her shoulders for the evening. She told me a story from her early career, back when she was younger than I am now. She painted the picture in careful strokes, the long nights, the endless self-doubt, the moments when she thought about quitting but never did. There was no arrogance in her voice, only a quiet honesty, the kind that doesn't need embellishment. I found myself leaning in, elbows resting lightly on the table, not wanting to miss a single detail. And as she spoke, I noticed something I hadn't before. There was a fragility behind her strength, a tender vulnerability she didn't often let slip. It made her seem real, not just the sharp, composed figure at the head of the boardroom, but a woman who had fought battles and carried scars she rarely showed. She laughed at herself after one memory, a misstep in front of her first major client. Her laughter was low, a little self-deprecating, and her hand brushed through her hair almost shyly as she told it. I couldn't help but smile, because for the first time, I wasn't looking at my boss. I was looking at someone human, imperfect, and all the more beautiful for it. When her words faded into silence, I let mine take their place. I told her about my own struggles, how I sometimes felt like I didn't belong, how the world seemed to expect more from me than I knew how to give. I half expected her to dismiss it, the way most people older than me might, but she didn't. She just listened, really listened. Her gaze didn't shift away, her hands rested still on the table, and I could feel the weight of her attention as though she were holding every word I said carefully in her palms. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it was fuller than the conversation, thick with something I couldn't quite name. Her hand rested on the desk between us, close enough that the faintest movement would have bridged the gap. I could feel the warmth radiating from her skin, and though we weren't touching, it felt as though we were already sharing something unspoken. I wanted to reach out, to close that small space, but I didn't. Instead, I let the moment breathe. She must have felt it too, because her eyes dipped toward my hand briefly, then back up to meet mine with a flicker of hesitation. And in that look, in that tiny, fleeting glance, there was an entire conversation neither of us dared to voice. A confession of loneliness, a longing for connection, a question neither of us was ready to answer, but both of us were willing to sit with. The walls between us were lowering, and once they had, I wasn't sure they could ever be rebuilt again. She had pulled the folder closer, flipping through a few pages as if trying to shift us back toward business. But even in the dim light, I could see her attention wasn't fully on the papers. Her movements were slower, more deliberate, as though she were giving herself time to think. At one point, she stood and circled the table, coming to stand behind me. "Let me show you something," she said softly, placing the file in front of me. I felt her presence before I even saw her, the faint warmth of her body leaning close, the brush of her sleeve against my shoulder. She bent slightly, her arm resting on the table near mine, her other hand pointing to a line of text. But I couldn't focus on the words. All I could register was the way her hair slipped forward, grazing my temple, the faint scent of her perfume surrounding me in a way that made the rest of the world fall away. Her voice was low, close to my ear now. Each syllable seemed to vibrate through me, quiet but unavoidably intimate. I nodded, though I hadn't really processed what she said. My attention was somewhere else entirely. caught in the nearness of her, the warmth radiating from her sleeve brushing mine, the awareness that if either of us shifted even slightly, we'd be touching. And then she didn't move. Not right away. She stayed leaned over, her breath feathering softly against my cheek. I could feel the tension in the air, stretched taut like a string pulled to its limit. Neither of us seemed ready to break it. Finally, slowly, she straightened, but not before her hand lingered for a moment longer on the back of my chair, her fingertips barely grazing the fabric, yet somehow sending a shiver straight through me. When our eyes met again, there was no hiding it. The air between us was heavy with something unspoken, something that didn't belong in a normal office, didn't belong between a boss and her employee. But it was there, undeniable. Her gaze held mine a fraction too long. I noticed the faint uncertainty flickering in her expression, as though she was caught between control and surrender. It wasn't a look of authority. It was a look of possibility and risk. I swallowed, trying to steady myself. My heart was pounding, but outwardly I forced calm, not wanting to push, not wanting to ruin what was unfolding so carefully. She gave the faintest smile then, a curve of her lips that carried both hesitation and invitation. It was gone almost as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the practiced neutrality I was more familiar with. But I had seen it. I had felt it. The office was still the same. The desk, the files, the faint glow of the city outside. But between us, the ground had shifted. We were no longer just boss and employee sharing tea late at night. We were two people standing on the edge of something neither of us had expected, but both of us felt pressing closer with every breath. And once you stand that close to someone, it's almost impossible to step back the same way again. The quiet between us stretched, long enough that I thought she might retreat back into her composed self. But instead, she tilted her head slightly, studying me the way someone studies a puzzle they're not sure they should solve. "You're cold, aren't you?" she asked suddenly, her tone lighter than before, almost teasing. I shook my head out of habit, though in truth the room had grown cooler as the night deepened. Before I could answer properly, she was already standing, reaching for the scarf draped over the back of her chair. It was a soft, dark fabric, one I'd noticed her wear in the mornings when the weather turned brisk. She stepped closer, holding it loosely in her hands as though deciding whether to follow through. Then, with a quiet resolve, she leaned in and looped it gently around my neck. Her fingers brushed against the side of my jaw as she adjusted it, lingering just a heartbeat too long. The touch was feather-light, but it seemed to echo through me, sharper than any words could be. My breath caught without my permission. She must have felt it too, because when her hand slipped away, her eyes flicked up to mine, searching, waiting. For an instant, the air felt charged again, filled with all the things neither of us dared say out loud. I didn't move, didn't speak. I only held onto the scarf, my fingers curling into the fabric as if it carried the warmth of her touch. And maybe it did, because even after she stepped back, I could still feel it, as though some part of her lingered with me. She gave a small laugh then, soft and a little uncertain, breaking the spell just enough to let us both breathe again. "Well," she said lightly, "consider that part of your overtime benefits." I laughed too, though mine came out quieter, more hesitant, like I was afraid the moment might vanish if I was too loud. Still, the sound eased something between us. But the glance we exchanged after, that wasn't playful. That wasn't light. Her eyes held mine, steady and unguarded, and in them I saw a flicker of something I'd been too afraid to name until now. Desire, yes, but wrapped in hesitation. An unspoken question. For a moment, I thought about saying something, anything, to bridge the gap between what we felt and what we admitted. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I let my silence speak for me, hoping she could read it in the way I held her gaze, in the way I let the scarf remain draped across me like a token I wasn't ready to return. She didn't look away. Her lips parted slightly, as though she might speak, but no words followed. Only that lingering look, fragile, dangerous, and impossibly tender. And in that suspended moment, it became clear we had crossed some invisible line. Not with a kiss, not with a declaration, but with a scarf, a touch, and a silence heavy enough to change everything. The scarf still rested loosely around my shoulders, carrying her warmth even though she'd stepped back. I found myself holding onto the edge of it, as though letting go would mean losing something I wasn't ready to give up. She sat again, but not at her desk, Instead, she pulled her chair closer to mine, the space between us narrowing until I could see the subtle rise and fall of her breath, the way her fingers toyed absent-mindedly with the edge of a folder. It was a nervous habit, I realized. For all her composure in the office, right now she wasn't as steady as she seemed. The silence that stretched out felt heavier than before. Not awkward, not empty, but charged, like a thread drawn too tight. Finally, she broke it, her voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. I shouldn't enjoy these evenings as much as I do. She said it with a small shake of her head, as if admitting something she'd tried to resist. Her eyes didn't meet mine right away. They lingered on the table, tracing invisible lines, before finally lifting. I swallowed, my chest tightening. Then maybe, I said slowly, carefully, I shouldn't look forward to them the way I do either. The words felt dangerous leaving my mouth, but there was no taking them back. For a moment, I wondered if I had gone too far. If she would retreat, remind me of the roles we played in daylight. But she didn't. Her lips parted slightly, not in protest, but in something closer to relief. Like I had spoken aloud the very thing she had been holding back. Her hand shifted then, moving from the folder to rest on the table, closer to mine than before. My pulse quickened. I could see the faint tremor in her fingers, the kind that comes not from fear, but from vulnerability. Slowly, carefully, I turned my hand until the edge of my fingers brushed hers. The contact was nothing more than a touch, barely there, feather-light. But it sent a warmth through me, so sharp it felt almost like a confession. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let her fingers rest against mine, hesitant at first, then with a quiet certainty that told me everything her words couldn't. When she finally spoke again, her voice carried the weight of something deeply personal. You make me forget how alone I feel sometimes. It was the kind of sentence that left no room for pretense. I felt my throat tighten because I understood. More than she knew, I understood. You're not alone tonight, I whispered. The faintest smile curved her lips, but her eyes glistened in a way that told me it wasn't amusement. It was something raw, something real. We didn't move closer, didn't cross the final boundary. But in the soft press of her fingers against mine, in the silence that wrapped around us, there was more truth than in any declaration. It wasn't just attraction anymore. It was something deeper, fragile, unspoken, but alive between us. And in that fragile space, I knew we had stepped into something neither of us could deny. The night had stretched far later than I realized. The office was silent around us, the hum of the building softer now, as though even the walls were asleep. Our hands still rested together on the table, not entwined, not bold, but close enough that the warmth of her skin lingered against mine. It felt like a fragile truce neither of us wanted to break. Eventually, she exhaled, a breath that sounded almost reluctant. She glanced toward the window where the city lights glittered against the dark, then back at me. It's late, she said gently, though her hand didn't move from where it touched mine. I nodded, but neither of us made the first move to rise. There was something sacred about the stillness, as if standing up too quickly would erase everything we had carefully, silently built over the course of the evening. Finally, she withdrew her hand, slow and deliberate, as if every inch of space between us cost her something. She reached for her blazer, slipping it over her shoulders again. It was like watching her put the armor back on, the familiar version of her, composed and professional. And yet, as she adjusted the lapel, she gave me a smile that didn't belong to the boss I knew. It belonged to the woman who had shared tea, laughter, and a confession. Come on, she said softly. Let's get out of here. We walked together through the quiet corridors, our footsteps echoing lightly against the tile. The building felt different at this hour, stripped of its daytime urgency. It was just a hollow shell, bearing witness to something neither of us could have planned. At the lobby doors, she slowed her pace, falling into step so close that our shoulders brushed now and then. Each accidental touch felt intentional, carrying more weight than it should have. I didn't pull away, and neither did she. Outside, the air was cool, crisp with the kind of night breeze that wakes you fully. She wrapped her arms lightly around herself, and without thinking, I adjusted the scarf still draped around my neck. It smelled faintly of her, and I caught the way her eyes flickered toward it before meeting mine again. There was no hiding the meaning there. We paused at the curb where her car waited, the glow of the streetlight casting a soft halo above us. For a moment, Neither of us spoke. She looked at me with that same searching expression she'd worn earlier, the one that asked more questions than either of us dared answer. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. "Not for staying late. For tonight." I wanted to say more, to put words to the pull I felt toward her, but all that came out was a nod and a simple, "Me too." She gave a small smile, one that reached her eyes this time, before stepping into her car. I stood there as she started the engine, watching the way she lingered just a second longer before pulling away. And as the red glow of her taillights disappeared into the city, I felt it settle in my chest, the certainty that tonight had changed everything. Staying late had never been about work. It had been about her, about us. And no matter what tomorrow looked like, I knew I wouldn't forget the way she looked back at me before driving away, as if she already knew neither of us could return to the way things were. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video, share it with someone who loves a good slow burn romance, and subscribe for more stories about unexpected connections and forbidden attraction. Your support helps me keep creating these moments for you. 14.